Wardens, as headmasters and leading heads of an Anglican institution, would have been compelled to hobnob with colonial officials, and they did. And you had people like the governor of Ceylon coming in as chief guest of prize giving. You wouldn't expect them to criticize colonial rule, they'll valorize it. And there were leading all boys who actually defended colonial rule.
174 limited edition publications of this. The 175th edition will be auctioned.
Schools have their own culture. St. Thomas's or Royal or St. Joseph's or so on and so forth. They have their individual cultures and subcultures. I put my hand on my keyboard and started writing the book. Made it very clear that we had to approach St. Thomas's from this dual perspective of what it had given to Sri Lankan society and how Sri Lankan society over the years had molded it.
Welcome back to a brand new episode of Power Moves. Today's episode is very special, personally to me, because we will be talking about a topic. We will be talking about a publication that is very close to my heart as well. And today's publication, or rather today's conversation, will surround a publication that has been published in the interest of a fraternity and also for the information of the entire Sri Lankan and world over populace about an institution that has been established over 175 years ago and continues to shape young men into men of character. So today's conversation surrounds 175 years of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia, and a coffee table book was recently released on the occasion of the 175th anniversary of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia, named Enduring Works, the Thomian Journey. As you can see, this is the very special publication that has been released in lieu of the 175th anniversary of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia. And today I have the author who had the daunting task of completing this publication in just 8 months with me in the studio. Uditha Devapriya. Uditha, welcome on Power Moves. It's a pleasure to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Certainly. Uditha, let's talk about how you got into writing this coffee table book, because are you not a Thomian?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
As my friend Siddharth was very clear in his speech the other day, in a speech he gave the other day, I'm from an international school.
Right.
So totally different institution from both private and public schools in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
But this was an area that was right up my alley because it fit in with my research interests. I'm very interested in colonial history, and I've been involved in several research projects that delve into colonial history and, more importantly and specifically, colonial school histories.
Okay.
So when I was approached early last year in June, I said yes.
Amazing. When talking about the publication, Enduring Works, the Thomian Journey, let's start off with the title, because Enduring Works is said to be extracted from a monologue or a text that had been written by the founder of St. Thomas's College, the first Bishop of Colombo, Right Reverend James Chapman. Walk us through that first.
Well, the title basically reflects a speech he gave at the foundation stone laying ceremony in Mutwal. As you know, St. Thomas's began in Mutwal, which, now it's called Modara. Back then it was called Mutwal.
Yes.
It was the most fashionable area in the country. That's where the elite of the country lived. When you look at the topography of the region now, you wonder how that was so. But back in the early 19th century, that was where the who's who of Sri Lankan society lived. And it was only natural that the leading academic institutions of the country would be located there. There were 3 specific institutions. In 1835, the Colombo Academy was established there. That, of course, later became Royal College. St. Thomas's came out in 1851, and the oldest surviving Catholic school in Sri Lanka, St. Benedict's College, came to be in Kotahena. So I made this point in my book as well, that these 3 schools were located in this specific area around Mutwal, because that's where the who's who of Sri Lankan society lives. So when the foundation stone was being laid, James Chapman, the first Anglican bishop of Colombo, made this speech where he basically says, enduring works, things that last forever have humble beginnings. And it was from such a humble beginning that St. Thomas's College came to be. That's basically the significance and the meaning of the title.
Amazing. When documenting a 175-year-long legacy, where does one even begin, Uditha? What was your starting point?
My starting point was 2022. I'll tell you how. At the time, I was involved in a foreign policy think tank. I was working there as an international relations analyst. But as a hobby, I was pursuing historical research.
Right.
In 2020, I met two very bright young students called Utpala Vijayasuriya and Nimsara Tennakon. They are credited in the book as well. They got me interested in colonial history and colonial school histories.
Right.
Because as you know, in Sri Lanka, what is interesting to me as a history writer is schools have their own cultures. Whether it's St. Thomas's or Royal or St. Joseph's or so on and so forth. They have their individual cultures and subcultures. And I was fascinated by this. And I remember writing an article somewhere in 2022 where I made this point that you need to look at colonial history in Sri Lanka through the perspective of headmasters, matrons, students. And I made the point that you need to look at colonial history through sources like school journals and magazines. So that's where I really started researching into this area. Then 2023, 2024, 2025 came. I wrote several books, none of which had directly anything to do with colonial school history. But when this came about, since I had done a lot of the research at the Royal College Archives and at the St. Thomas's College Archives also, I went there and looked through the magazines. I felt this was something I could do in such a tremendously short time. So if I hadn't done, if that foundation wasn't there, I don't think I would have been able to go ahead with this book. But because it was there, thanks in part to my cohort of research assistants, Utpala and Nimsara especially, it was already in place.
Right. So you mentioned that you had to write this and publish the book in a tremendously short time.
Yes.
Credit goes to you and your team, of course. But can you just give us the lowdown on how that worked out? When did the genesis of this book begin?
Well, the genesis of this book began long before I even heard about it. Apparently, it began in February 2025.
Right.
One thing led to another, and 5 months down the line, I was recovering from a huge injury in my leg. And all of a sudden, I got this call asking me to come to St. Thomas's College. And basically, I was given a concept note.
Right.
I was asked to give my views on it. And I gave my views. And that very night in June, I got the job, so to speak.
Wow.
I didn't realize that I would get the team I did because it was a dream team. I have to, no two words about it. From coordination to sourcing images and research materials, we spent 3 months doing all that, scanning materials and stuff like that. I was assisted in this by my research assistant on this project, Manusha Gunaratna, very good and old friend of mine. He went there whenever I asked him to. He went to Lake House Archives, National Archives, and so on and so forth. I had a couple also other people as well from my side. The St. Thomas's College itself had a cohort of young student researchers. About 5 of them, and they helped me tremendously as well in those first 3 months. 3 months was spent on collecting data. 2 months was spent on writing the book. I was writing an average of about 3 to 4 chapters a month. If you're not a full-time writer, that's an impossible task.
Definitely, because this book consists of 300 plus pages.
Yes, and 6 chapters. So 5 chapters on the history of the college and another chapter on the possible future of the college. That, of course, I was assisted a lot by a member of the team called Sasanka Banda. Because, I mean, even though I know the history of the college, it takes a Thomian to tell me what they think the future of college would be.
Certainly.
So I had a dream team, photographers, designers. Pramit Malivarich did a tremendously good job. I couldn't have asked for a better designer. And he himself was a Thomian, so he knew what he was doing. A veteran designer in himself. I was assisted by my impromptu set of volunteer research assistants who came at my bidding and did what I wanted them to do for nothing. And all credit goes to them as well. There was a committee specially designated for the task of taking this book forward.
Yes.
All the way, from Siddharth Gajanayaka, Neelan Ganesadas, and there were so many others. Neelan, Siddharth, Warren, Darren, Chintaka Mendes, and so on and so forth. There were other names as well. These people really put in their best and then some.
Right. some of these names resonate with me as well because some of these names are from my own batch. And Neelan, of course, used to be head prefect of ours. Warren and Darren from my batch as well, good friends of mine. So this rings true with me as well very deeply. And moving on, Uditha, from your perspective, you mentioned that when you were researching, you said that each school has its own character and each school in Sri Lanka was defined by that character. So from your perspective, what made St. Thomas's College endure, not just physically, but culturally and philosophically as well?
Well, first of all, St. Thomas's is considered to be a leading Anglican institution in the country. Certainly the leading Anglican boys' school in Colombo and the suburbs. I think one reason why it survived for so long is because it had a set of wardens who defined the school as a sort of school that wasn't isolated from its surroundings. One point I make in this book is that if you take all the big transformative moments in our history, late 19th century, mid 20th century, the debates over language and education, the future of education in Sri Lanka, you had Thomians from all sides debating these issues. So, for instance, to give a very simple example, when proposals for free education were brought up, there were criticisms of those proposals from no less a figure than the warden of St. Thomas's at the time, R.S. Desera, the great R.S. Desera.
Great R.S.
But you also had N.M. Pereira, who was languishing in a jail in Valikada at the time because the Lanka Samsamaja Party was proscribed during the war, writing a pamphlet called The Case for Free Education, where he directly criticizes R.S. Desera's views. He verbatim criticizes his views. And then, of course, the independence struggle. We associated so much and justifiably with D.S. Senanayaka, who was a product of St. Thomas's. But you had so many contemporaries of his who framed independence from another perspective. So I would say what kept St. Thomas's at it for so long was because it was able to accommodate these contrasting views within a very compatible space. What do I mean by compatible space? I mean, as an education institution, we are aware that a school has this constant contradiction between the need to accommodate so many students and the need to keep a balance between the teacher and the student. So what happens when school numbers balloon out of proportion? It's very difficult for teachers to be student-centric. St. Thomas's, if you look at school student numbers, it has stabilized. It's not too much. It's not a overpopulated school. And that enables teachers to be student-centric. I think that's one reason why it has been kept relevant for so long, is because teachers are able to give the impression to students, not just that academics are important, but that there's a world beyond academics in which they can flourish.
Right.
And as you yourself are a good example of that, because you are in this field and you're flourishing in this field.
Thank you. I take that credit.
So it's not just rote learning, it's not just memorizing, it's beyond that. And I think that's what's kept an institution like St. Thomas's going.
Understood. Because we are talking about institutions, it is said that institutions are ultimately defined by its people. And when you are telling a story, essentially the story of St. Thomas's over 175 years, it's a fine balance between telling the story from a perspective of an old boy or a resource person versus the institution as a whole. So when you were penning this down, how did you balance or strike that balance within this publication?
Well, first of all, the research I had done until that point I put my hand on my keyboard and started writing the book, made it very clear that we had to approach St. Thomas's from this dual perspective of what it had given to Sri Lankan society and how Sri Lankan society over the years had molded it.
Yes.
So there are some very humorous anecdotes whereby even if you look at the school magazines, the cartoons in the school magazines are very indicative of there's a word for this, it's called the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times.
Yes.
That was my number one priority when I was charting this institution, because ultimately institutions cannot be unmoored from the societies they inhabit.
Certainly, yes.
And you can't talk about St. Thomas's without locating it in, number one, the society it was placed in, and number two, the subculture that evolved because of the society it was placed in. I mentioned earlier something about schools and their subcultures.
Yes.
Those subcultures are very much influenced by the students who inhabit them, the wardens.
Yes.
They are not products of a vacuum. They are a product of their societies. And those prejudices, however negative they may be, those little whims and fancies that make up our characters, they are there in the institution itself. That's something I've tried to reflect with this book.
So this book is not only a mapping out of 175 years of St. Thomas's, but also how Sri Lankan society has evolved over generations, isn't it?
Within the limits of a 320-page book, yes.
As much as you can.
As much as one can.
So when you were gathering data and extracting information for this book, Uditha, and mapping out the lives across generations of Thomians, did you notice any recurring traits or values that have transcended time and that remain until the contemporary age?
Well, I would say pluralism, and that's a value which I suppose not many rate as highly as they should. What do I mean by pluralism? I mean a pluralism of opinions and views, perspectives. There are magazine articles from the late 19th century which actively speculate on Ceylon being independent. Of course, they don't couch it in those terms because at the time, I don't think anyone really thought that Sri Lanka would be really independent of British rule. But there's always that sort of defiant note. Wardens as headmasters and leading heads of an Anglican institution would have been compelled to hobnob with colonial officials, and they did. And you had people like the governor of Ceylon coming in as chief guest of prize giving. I mean, you wouldn't expect them to criticize colonial rule. They'll valorize it. And there were leading old boys who actually defended colonial rule. But all this has to be put in the context of their time.
Yes.
My point is that what made St. Thomas's endure, and I'm going back to my earlier point, is that there were always people who debated these issues from both sides, who looked at it from radical lenses and conservative lenses. And that enriched the school and gave it the ethos that it has had since independence. Why do I say since independence? Because as we know, our education system has transformed completely since independence. There are schools that were considered elite at the time, which have since basically, I hesitate to use the word deteriorate, but I would say which have transformed considerably under government intervention, for the better and for the worse.
Yes.
St. Thomas's has tried to not isolate itself from those developments, but to adapt. The challenge of change has always been there with St. Thomas's College, and it's a challenge which I think it has kept up with reasonably well.
Amazing. When we talk about St. Thomas's and the educators who allowed this school to flourish, all the way back from Right Reverend James Chapman to our longest serving warden, such as Warden Tiseram, and notable figures, notable old boys, including D.S. Senanaik, S.W.R.D. Bandaranaik, and so on. These are the key figures that you associate with St. Thomas's usually. But when you were gathering intel and data, were there any lesser known figures who you thought deserved more recognition through this publication?
Well, did you know there was a mutiny during World War II, and the leader of that mutiny, not in Sri Lanka, but in an island off the coast of Australia, was a Thomian. He was executed in Valikader. I heard this story many, many years ago. His name was Gratian Fernando. At the time, there were debates about independence in Sri Lanka, so you had the reformists of the Ceylon National Congress advocating for negotiations with the British. Then you had the radicals of the Lanka Samasamaja Party and the Communist Party calling for complete independence from the British, economically and politically. And then you had Gratian Fernando, who basically went out and said, let's do a mutiny. Not as celebrated as he should be, but you know, he's definitely a Thomian national icon in the sense that he tried to lead a resistance movement against the British at the time.
Okay.
So there were many other figures like that. One other example I can think of is the great writer Reggie Sirivardhana. I don't know whether you heard of him, but Reggie Sirivardhana was easily post-independence Sri Lanka's one of the greatest writers in English that we had.
Right.
He was pivotal in reforming our English language and English literature syllabus. Then there are other figures, the radical poet Lagdas Wickramasinghe, who wrote so much about various social themes that were resonant in that era from a very radical perspective. Then you had Douglas Valathara, who was easily the most radical educationist in English at the time, because he basically came up with a textbook for English to be used as a second language by Sinhala and Tamil rural children. So you had these little figures. One quotation that makes its way to this book. It's by an old Thomian I had the pleasure of conversing with about 2 years ago. Because in the history of St. Thomas's College, there are many old boys who haven't got the acknowledgement they have.
Yes.
And it's up to, I just wrote the book, but it's up to other chroniclers of college to take those stories forward
yeah.
and to reveal them for what they are.
So how many sections or rather chapters does this book have?
There are 6 chapters. The first chapter delves into the early history of the school until its founding, the prehistory of the school. The second chapter charts the Mutwal years, basically right until the point when it basically goes to Mount Lavinia in 1918. And then from that point onwards until the onset of the Second World War is basically chapter 3. Chapter 4 charts the history of the college until 1978, which is, as you know, a very pivotal moment in our country's history when everything started to change. There was a changing government. And then from that point onwards, chapter 5 is about the history of the college until the present. Then chapter 6 takes it even further
To the future.
by speculating about the future of college in terms of the many infrastructure and development projects that are taking place, because we must realize that the school of the future will not be like what it is now. With AI, with the need for training in new fields, how is college adapting to that? It's all very I would say it's all a matter of speculation now. But it's always good to speculate rather than ignore it altogether, these developments. So that's how the book has been basically sequenced and chapterized.
Maybe your foresight might even come true.
Well,
Maybe
you never know.
2-3 decades down the line.
Yes, yes.
So when penning these chapters, penning the 6 chapters on this publication, Uditha, was there a particular area that took longer to shape, either because of its complexity or because of its importance?
Well, ironically, the early history of the college until the 1930s was the easiest.
Okay.
But that was because I had done a lot of that research before. As I moved on to the present, things became harder.
Right.
Because you had to make a call on what to include and what not. And I was aware that there is a committee that would help me in that. And that proved to be very pivotal in the final call I made on these issues. The future was obviously very difficult for me because you need that sort of insider perspective. And once again, I am really thankful to Sasanka Bandara, who actually helped me with that chapter. The first chapter, which is about the prehistory of the college, there I was given a lot of advice by Chintaka Mendis because, as I said, he and I both write on history.
Yes.
He has written a book on the early history of Sri Lanka. It was very pleasant to know that I was working in a committee that actually had a person who was interested in that field. Very interested. And these two people really helped me shape the first and the last chapters. Beyond that, I don't think I faced any difficulties at all. Of course, what came after the writing of the book with regard to the edits and all was also a bit of a smooth ride. But then the hardest part for me was actually proofreading. It becomes very difficult because you are the worst judge of your own writing.
Yes.
You have to have another person look into it.
Yeah, great. Amazing. So in your research, Uditha, how did Sri Lanka, or rather St. Thomas's College, respond to national moments of crisis in Sri Lanka, or even moments of transformation? What was St. Thomas's contribution like in those times?
Well, I think the most cited examples would be the crisis of the 1950s with regard to the language debates and all that. Of course, all that has been written about, but let me take a very recent example. Under Warden Professor Indra de Souza, there was this initiative called Sound Bodies. Sound Mind,
Sound Body, Sound Mind.
Sound Body, Sound Mind. That became very useful with regard to difficult conversations when the Easter attacks happened. And I know from friends of mine who were studying at college, there's one of my research assistants on board this book was a boy called Muhammad Shafkat, who has been a research assistant of mine for a long time. He told me how easy it was to have those very difficult conversations because Sound Body, Sound Mind was there.
Yeah.
So those conversations were easy to have because the groundwork had already been laid. So there I must emphasize the important role that wardens play in setting the pace and the tone for the rest of the school to follow. Again, you need a culture of tolerance, and we were living at a time, I'm sure you remember those times as well,
Certainly.
when it was impossible to go out without hearing some sort of bigoted remark about the Muslim community. I think that kind of initiative is very progressive, but it's yet to be seen whether we are talking a lot about education reforms in this country now. It's a very pivotal moment. It's yet to be seen whether such initiatives will take hold of other schools and institutions as they should.
Amazing. So that's yet another example of the trait you mentioned that continues to endure over the years, which is pluralism.
Yes. And the other major point I have to make is these reforms were never artificially stalled by later wardens. Now, in Sri Lanka, as much as in the rest of the world, you have this basically not my contribution, not my baby kind of attitude, where whatever your predecessor did, you try to reverse. But with initiatives like what Warden Desaadam brought about in the 1950s and what Warden Indra de Soysa brought about with Sound Body, Sound Mind, these were continued and added to by Reverend Mark Billy Moria and so on and so forth. It's important that there's continuity in these reforms.
Amazing. So at 175 years, our college is steeped in history. I say our college because I'm also a proud product of St. Thomas's College. But history also looks forward, Uditha. What can contemporary Sri Lanka, contemporary St. Thomas's College learn from its history of 135 years?
Well, I'll answer that question by bringing an example from another school. I don't know whether you heard of this great educationist called Clara Motwani. She was one of the principals of Visakha Vidyalaya, back when Visakha Vidyalaya was not a state institution. What's interesting, when she was principal there, the point that she made constantly, and a point that was echoed by almost all educationists from that time, is there'll always be this contradiction between huge student numbers and the ability of teachers and officials to concentrate on each of them. I think student-centric learning is the way forward. But whether we are sacrificing that in the present context by basically accumulating so many students in one class sizes, whether there's an incompatibility between class size and this need for student centrism, I think that's a great lesson that institutions like St. Thomas's can teach us, because it's a point that makes its way to my book as well. And it's a point that was echoed by a lot of educationists back in the 1930s and 1940s, when we had these debates about the future of education in the country. So I think looking back at these 175 years, it's that point which has stayed relevant and will stay relevant going forward.
Amazing. So as we continue to have this conversation, unfortunately, we are running out of time. But Uditha, any closing thoughts, any parting words you would like to mention to our audience?
Well, I am a researcher and I've been researching for a long time. One important lesson I've learned is you have to involve young people in projects of this sort. I was assisted by a very able research assistant, Manusha, and I was assisted by a dream team, the committee, the editorial committee and the book committee of the book, the committee in the book, involved in the book. It's very important to involve the young, they are the future of the country.
Yes.
If you don't involve them, if this book becomes another self-congratulatory narrative, then it becomes meaningless. You need to involve them. And it's that involvement that I think colors this book more than even my contribution.
Amazing. So as St. Thomas's College stepped forward from its 175th year into the future, Enduring Works, the Thomian Legacy, this publication will serve as a reminder that legacy is built on continuity, purpose, and the values lived across generations. And I'm sure Uditha Devapriya has incorporated all that into this 300 plus page book. Uditha, I'm sorry I couldn't ask you this before. I know there are 174 limited edition publications of this. The 175th edition will be auctioned. But if an interested audience member wants to purchase this, how can they do that?
The 175th?
Yes.
Well, let time tell that.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Uditha Devapriya, for joining me today on Power Moves to discuss Enduring Works, the Thomian Journey, which traces 175 years of St. Thomas's College, Mount Lavinia. Thank you very much to our viewers for visiting Power Moves and watching Power Moves and continuing to support us. Thank you, Uditha. We hope to see you again on a different episode, hopefully talking about a different topic as well.
My thoughts exactly.
Thank you very much and have a great day.